Hello again, everyone. Pastor Mark and Pastor Zac here with something that we haven't done for a little while. That is a video down in the church basement/ministry center. And one of the reasons that we are recording this video is that I promised that I would during my sermon this past Sunday. And in that sermon, I had been preaching from Ezra 4, and I've always found it helpful that when I'm going straight through a book of the Bible, there are so often things that happen in our world that correspond right in directly with something that God has taught in His Word. Maybe something happening to the Israelites or the Jews or the New Testament people of God as well in the church. And I think that certainly happened this past week, where I had planned to preach through Ezra, and that was intentional in some part because Ezra is about a people who are being regathered, a people who are leaving isolation from one another and coming into the presence of God and fellowship with each other by returning from Babylon into Jerusalem. And they're going to rebuild this city, rebuild the temple, rebuild the altar is the first thing that they did. And in a similar kind of way that we're having to rebuild different parts of our lives at this point because of the coronavirus pandemic. So I thought, well, it would be a helpful book to explore and look for some ways that we can learn from this rebuilding effort, how it went well, and starting in chapter 4, how it didn't go so well. So I read from Ezra 4, and I want to read from Ezra 4 verses 21 through 24 for our consideration today. And hear these words. This is after Rehum, who is an opposer, an opposition to the Jews rebuilding the temple, gives a gossipy, slanderous report to Artaxerxes, who is in charge of this kingdom. And Artaxerxes is the king. He gets this report. He believes a slanderous report about the Jews. And then here's what he says in verse 21. Now issue an order to these men to stop work, so that this city will not be rebuilt until I so order. Be careful not to neglect this matter. Why let this threat grow to the detriment of the royal interests? And as soon as the copy of the letter of King Artaxerxes was read to Rehum and Shimshai the secretary and their associates, they went immediately to the Jews in Jerusalem and compelled them by force to stop. Thus the work on the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. And I mentioned that a commentator has done some of the math work for us in figuring out that that was a 15-year break in rebuilding the temple. Now, the question that I know a lot of people will have is that what is happening today in the United States and in many countries throughout the world, where governments are telling churches that they may not meet in person inside their buildings? And it's a complicated question to work through. And so I figured, just as I said in my sermon, we need to give a little bit of attention to this more than we could kind of spend in a sermon. And so we're going to take a little bit of time to unpack that question. Are the events of Ezra 4 happening in our context today? Artaxerxes told the Jews to stop rebuilding the temple. Is that the same thing as today the governor of California or Michigan or Illinois or some other prime minister in a country somewhere telling people you cannot go in person to church right now because of coronavirus? Let's start with the ways that it is similar, and then we'll get to the ways that it is not similar. So in what way do you think this is similar to what is happening right now, Zac?
Well, it's obviously true that the churches are being restricted from doing what would normally be practiced on Sunday mornings. There are now government mandates that have been set in place that call the church not to, in California in particular, not to meet indoors,
not to
sing inside especially. And so those are some really big ones. To practice social distancing, of course, to take certain precautionary measures. And so no longer are we seeing worship services proceed the way that they formerly did prior to March. And so There on the face of it, there is some very clear parallels between the ceasing of work on rebuilding the temple and here in our state and across the world, really, of having Christians not be doing what would normally be done.
Yeah.
And so on the face of it, there's undeniably some similarities.
Particularly, I would say, with singing and with the practice of the sacrament of communion, baptism probably as well, being particularly verboten, disallowed at this time. And so, where the government says to do specific things or you're not allowed to do specific things, we should be asking the question at least, is this another example of an Artaxerxes injecting himself into authority where obviously God has the highest authority?
Yeah.
I would say, adding to that, given that there are some things that seem similar, the spirit of many of our governing authorities has been, even before coronavirus, antagonistic and anti-Christian. So we should have our eyes open to the fact that, again, in our context, which is California, Gavin Newsom is our governor, that Gavin Newsom, who is the governor, really hates a lot of things that we teach in our church. He does not like the Christian view of sexuality. He opposes our efforts in supporting women who want to have children and encouraging people not to get abortions and even calling something like abortion a very serious and grievous sin. And so there are people in our authority in our state who, in the past, before coronavirus, openly opposed the message of the church. Now, I don't think that they have ever explicitly opposed the message of the gospel itself, which is that Jesus Christ has died on the cross and is risen from the dead, and this work of Christ atones for our sin and draws us into the presence of God, and Christ will return to judge the living and the dead. I don't think he has ever explicitly opposed those things. From what I researched a little bit getting ready for this video, he claims to be a practicing Catholic, and so I would guess he may compartmentalize his faith a little bit and kind of put that doctrine of justification in a little compartment and some of these other Christian ethical issues into another compartment. But I don't think it's slanderous or gossipy to say that many in authority in our state and in our nation oppose the traditional Christian faith. And so we should have our eyes open to the possibility that they wouldn't have very much urgency in allowing for churches to gather together once again, because they have said in the past they oppose the things that we stand for. And so why would they be all busy getting ready for churches hopefully being able to find creative ways of meeting and so forth? So I don't think we're saying that the sky is falling, and I don't think that we're saying Gavin Newsom is the Antichrist or the devil incarnate or something. That might be how certain people feel about their governor, about their prime minister, or somebody who is kind of getting in the way of the church having some freedom that we once enjoyed.
Yeah.
However, we do need to have our eyes open that there are those in our government who have vocally opposed some of the things that we stand for. And so that may be motivating the lack of urgency to allow us to resume regular activities.
Yeah, there's interesting parallels there, as you're saying. Chapter 4, verses 4 and 5, we see sort of the motivations behind why the people of the land, which is where the Jewish exiles are now returning to what was formerly their land. Now it's been settled by a different people. So these people don't like this, of course, and their motivations are revealed to us in verses 4 and 5. The people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and frightened them from building and hired counselors against them to frustrate their counsel all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So there's an opposition here. Of course, the opposition is because these people are retaking this land, and that would have caused obvious tension. And so they find common cause with King Artaxerxes to say, look, these people, if they rebuild their temple, they're not going to be paying you tribute anymore. They're going to basically be setting up a rebellious kingdom right under your nose. And so we have common cause to not allow these people to do it, even though King Cyrus had given full permission to this. And so there is some sort of plan and antipathy that they have towards the people of God. And in the same way, it's clear that part of the California government structure, our state, is pretty opposed to what Christianity teaches. Now, they haven't gone so far as to make any blanket statements against no preaching the gospel ever. We don't find ourselves in China. It's very different than that, and so that's where it can get a little complex.
Yeah, and I would say one more thing about this, a way that this is similar, is that that there are contexts right now where the gospel is being prevented from entering. For example, in prisons, like in the prison ministry that I do, I haven't been allowed to go into the prison, and there are some good logical reasons for that. They don't want somebody from the outside coming into Dual Vocational Institute where I go with my little team and bringing coronavirus, and then it spreads out throughout the prison like it has already done at San Quentin prison. And so they want to be careful of that. However, I would hope that they're also trying to work towards providing for the spiritual care of the people who are there through the chaplains and through creative means. I have my doubts that that is happening based on things that have been said. And so I don't want it to seem like we're automatically assuming that the whole lockdown is anti-Christian, or that even the policy to meet outdoors instead of indoors is necessarily anti-Christian. But the reason I bring up the opposition to Christianity in the government is that we should at least have our eyes open to think, I've heard this person say you're opposing progress for the LGBTQ plus community, and we're going to do everything we can to stop you from putting a halt to that progress that we're seeing. And so when such types of things are said, then we should also have our eyes open with scenarios like what we're in now and ask, could this be part of the reason that there is at times a little bit of hypocrisy between the commercial sector and the religious sector, and regarding what the rules are, even just for gathering indoors. So that's kind of ways that it is similar, but just as I said in my sermon, mostly Ezra 4 and our situation today are dissimilar. And the main reason for that, I believe, is that for the Jews returning from exile, the first thing they were called to do was build their altar and start performing the regular sacrifices to show their repentance, to show their worship of the living God. And they built that altar even before they built the temple. And so they have the altar, they're doing these sacrifices, and then they're building the temple up around it. And the temple signified also their need for the presence of God, their need to show love to God by building something beautiful for Him, and their need to go to the house of the Lord to present sacrifices before Him. And so this is an essential action of the Old Testament people of God. The sacrificial system, the mediating work of the priests, even the prophetic work, which would have often happened around the temple or in Jerusalem, and also the presenting of sacrifices in that place. And so that is the foundational spiritual activity of the people of God in the Old Testament. I would say along with prayer and worship, it was the sacrificial system and the celebration of things like Passover. And so putting that into the New Testament, we might ask, what now is the central work, the foundational activity of the New Testament church? And that would be the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ, of His kingdom. And so we proclaim that Jesus has died and has risen, just as the text tells us to, proclaim the Lord's death until He returns. And so that's what we do. And we have been able to do that every single day of this coronavirus. No one has said you may not preach the gospel. No one has said you may not record videos and share them with your church. Certainly no one has said you can't gather and record a video. Even at church, they've made an exception for small groups of people to gather in a church building. And so that exception was in our favor, where we could do that and present a live streamed worship service.
Yeah.
So that is different in that the fundamental activity was disallowed in Ezra 4, but the fundamental activity of the Christian today is still allowed today, through some creative means, of course, often outdoors now, but it is still allowed to go forth. And so I would say generally would see this text being more dissimilar than similar to our situation today.
Yeah, I can understand the push of Christians who are wanting to reopen and get back to normal as soon as possible. Has the government made many mistakes in this whole situation? Yes. Have they been inconsistent? Yes. Have they been favorable to some groups and disfavorable to others? Yes.
Yeah.
Does that mean that the coronavirus is not real or that it's all a scam and a joke? Not necessarily, no. It could be true that the government has made mistakes, that the scientific community has made mistakes, and at the same time that coronavirus is very serious and something that we should continue to take seriously. This gets into the debates of which experts are we following, and so there's an epistemic or a sort of knowledge crisis because we don't know who to follow at all times. So I can totally understand that, but I do think for now, and this is I think where Mark and I both stand, this does seem to be a very serious public health issue that is still taking place. And so we're okay with being told you must meet outside for a time. Now the question comes in, how long is this going to be okay for? If this lasts for 6 more years, just to say a ridiculous number.
15 in this case, yeah.
And numbers are way down to basically 0. There's been a vaccine found, and there were still, Newsom has not allowed for California churches to reopen.
Yeah.
That would be a serious issue. Some people say that this is already the case. It's already gone on for far too long. One example of this would be John MacArthur's church. And so I can see how there's some issues there. But the idea here is not so much that I feel like the government has not been using this as a great opportunity just to get Christians to stop meeting. It has been applied pretty generally against all groups of all kinds of people. There is the protests that are the big counter argument. That's a good counter argument. But in general, this is true of all kinds of gatherings of people.
Yeah.
And so it's not just a specific attack on the churches. We're still allowed to do the most vital aspects of what the church is called to do, and that has not been inhibited. And so to see ourselves as being completely stopped, as the people were for 15 years in Ezra 4, it's not exactly a one-to-one comparison.
Well, and you just think of, the text didn't say this, but we could certainly assume that these neighbors of Israel were totally permitted to, in their temple practices, to continue doing whatever their religion called them to do while Israel was not. And the text doesn't exactly say that, but we can assume it based on just common sense, basically.
Yeah, and what we know.
And so if it was only Christian churches that were disallowed from meeting indoors or celebrating communion, then obviously there would be a case of outright, blatant persecution happening. And this is happening in some countries where, particularly China, towards the Muslim people of China. I don't know exactly how you say the word. I think it's Uyghur. The Uyghur people, a million people who live in China who are Muslims, are in concentration camps right now for reprogramming and things of that nature. And then many churches also, Christian churches, have been wrecked. Mosques have been leveled and turned into parking lots. There's satellite imagery to show all this. That's what persecution looks like when there's an exception made for a particular group of people that disagrees with the state in some way. And I do believe that generally across the religious landscape of the United States and of California, it has been fair towards Sikh and Muslim and Christian, and I suppose atheist people don't go to church, and so they're a little bit excluded from that. But where we see Christians particularly singled out, or we see anyone particularly singled out, we need to be against that, so that there would be freedom to worship the living God. Now, maybe in closing, I think that it is important to note that it's likely that with our yes, it's similar, and no, it's not similar, we would have upset or offended some people because you feel it's exactly the same thing. It's persecution, a lot like what Zac mentioned, John MacArthur feels, or you feel, no, this is not, and Christians, absolutely, we just have to hunker down and live in quarantine. And you could maybe be a little bit offended that we need to have our eyes open to the possibility that this could turn into persecution. And certainly it hasn't been our desire to offend, but to try to unpack something in the scriptures in a logical, helpful way, and mostly to give hope that this is not going to last forever. It can sometimes feel like it will. Zac and I were just getting started saying, wow, we started doing this in March, and now it's August. And that's kind of sad to us that we can't be sitting with a whole bunch of people in person right now having these conversations. But the Lord has been faithful to his church. He's promised the gates of Hades will not overcome it. And we can be confident that that promise will remain true. And it will require creativity. I think for quite a while it will require that we meet outdoors, which has been a wonderfully blessed time of worship for me, at least, in the last several weeks. And for those who can't come and meet outdoors, are encouraged to connect with creative ways through phone calls and cards and Zoom and other ways like that. So it is a strange time, and we're looking for answers, and we go to the Bible for them. But I guess I want to guard against jumping too quickly to the persecution card. Why? Because we have been allowed to preach the gospel. We have been allowed even to get creative about fellowship with each other. Now we are participating in the sacrament of communion again, and as long as these things are happening, we can be confident that we do have freedom to exercise our faith in the United States and in the state of California. So hopefully that gives you some encouragement. Yes, things are getting better. Hopefully things are available to us for our spiritual care and meeting our spiritual needs. But also, I think that it is okay to say, let's open our eyes for the possibility that a day may come one day where real persecution happens. And then we need to be ready for it. Then we need to, just as I said in my sermon, overcome evil with good. Not with rebelliousness, not with bad attitudes, not with slandering one another or gossiping about one another and trying to figure out who's really the most zealous about opposing this persecution. No, we need to be together, unified in love for each other and for our neighbors as well. And so hopefully that was helpful as we unpack these things. And I hope that you have a good day and a good week. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.
See you guys.